Welcome back. So for this lecture, we're still in Unit 5, which is focused mostly on syntax, but this is going to move us into a sort of transition between the structures we've been looking at and what the next unit will offer, where we start looking at how language is used by different individuals and groups of people. So semantics is going to be focusing more on meaning as opposed to the structures itself. And so in this lecture, and then also in the additional videos that you have to cover for this, we'll be covering semantics and pragmatics. And semantics is in this lecture. You have a few additional videos for pragmatics, where semantics is just the study of meaning in language. And these are the kinds of meanings that you might expect to find in something like a dictionary. So these are the directly encoded meanings that are attached to the linguistic form. So when we think about form and function, this is sort of the meaning side of that, the function of the word itself and what it means when we're using it. And so these are relatively stable properties of linguistic expression. So the meaning of words can change over time, but typically when we think about the meaning of a word, we have a specific sort of set meaning at a given point in time, and it doesn't change drastically or anytime we're using it when we're using the main meaning of that word. Pragmatics, however, is the study of the language use and the context of language. So this moves beyond the direct meaning of a word itself and more on how we're interpreting the words, how we're understanding the way that language is being used, given the kinds of contexts that we might be using language in. And so that will be covered in the linked videos that you have on Blackboard, and we'll focus just on semantics for this particular lecture. And so the aspects that we'll cover, there's lots of different theories of semantics. There's many different ways to interpret semantics and how to understand meaning, including some very formal understandings that include logic. We won't be covering a lot of those kinds of things, but we will cover some that are very basic to understanding semantics. So we'll talk mostly about semantic roles. These are also known as theta roles. And so when we were looking at word classes and talking about how we can't use semantic evidence to put something into a word class, this is where we're going to get into that kind of evidence, that kind of relationship of what something's doing in a sentence, as opposed to the structural evidence we were using for word classes. And then we'll also look a little bit at taxonomy, so different hierarchies of meaning and how things sort of fit into each other. And then also some exemplars and prototypes, so how common or more common or less common something is in a sort of set of meanings, possible meanings. So for semantic roles, we're going to be looking at what sort of things different pieces of a sentence are doing. And so when we were looking at word classes, we were focusing on morphology and syntax as evidence, and we couldn't use semantics. But in addition to those grammatical relationships that things have in a sentence, there are still also those semantic relationships known as semantic roles or also theta roles. And these are sometimes encoded grammatically in some languages. So languages that have case systems or ergative languages that we don't really focus on in this class do have some of these embedded in. So case markings in Latvian, for instance, give some of the roles of what something's doing in a sentence. But in English, they're not as clear cut. So we usually need the context of the sentence itself to interpret what's happening in that sentence and what the role of different phrases actually are. So the common ones we'll look at, these are the ones that we see most frequently in many languages. So when we were thinking about verbs, when we were looking at, how do we define a verb, and people were saying it's an action word, well, not all verbs are action words, but there are agents that are doers of an action. So if there is an action verb, there's often an agent that's involved in a sentence as well. So the agent is a sort of doer of an action. And this is something that changes from language to language. What we consider an agent in English is typically something that can have agency, something we think of as being capable of doing something on its own. So humans, so many types of animals are the kinds of things that we usually give agency to. An inanimate object we wouldn't really think of as an agent because it can't actually do things on its own. So a fridge wouldn't be an agent, but a bird could be. So in these examples, Pat baked a cake. The cake was eaten by Alex. In a lot of cases, the agent is the subject, but if we put something into a passive sentence, like the second one, it doesn't have to be in the subject position to still be the agent. So you need to focus on the relationship of what's happening in the sentence, not just the structures of it. So Pat baked a cake. Pat is the one that's doing the action of baking, so that would be the agent. The cake was eaten by Alex. Alex is the one eating the cake. The cake isn't an agent. The cake isn't doing anything. Alex is the one doing something. So even though Alex is not in the subject position in a sentence, Alex is still acting on and doing something, so that would be the agent. Patients often go with an agent. Patients will always be a noun phrase, and this is something that is affected or changed by the action. So in the same sentences, Pat baked a cake. The cake is actually changed through the baking. So it starts as a batter and it ends up as a cake. There's some sort of change or being affected by the action itself. They're directly affected or changed. So the cake would end up being the patient here. And then in the second sentence, the cake was eaten by Alex. The cake is also a patient here because by eating the cake is affected by this. It's changed. There's an action that is affecting that specifically. And so it would also be a patient in this case. But as we mentioned, not all verbs are action verbs. And so things like copula constructions can often lead to a theta role of what's known as the experiencer, where the subject is experiencing some sort of physical or emotional state. They're not acting on anything. They're not doing anything. So this would be often the subject of a copula verb. So if I say Pat is tired, Pat is experiencing the state of tired. Alex is hungry. Alex is experiencing the feeling of hunger. So they're not doing something. They're experiencing some sort of physical or mental state. Some other common ones that you'll also see are things like the theme. So a theme is always a noun phrase, and themes will undergo motion or a change in location, or they're being located. So if Pat gave Alex a book, the book is the theme because that's what's changing location, that's what's undergoing motion. It's not really directly affected by the action of give the same way as a patient would be. So themes can often go with verbs that don't necessarily have an action, or if they do, they're not directly affected by that action. A theme can also be something like, my cousin is in Spain. So they're being located in Spain. They're not really experiencing a physical or mental state like an experiencer would, but they are being located, so this would be a theme in this case. The next two can sometimes get mixed up and be confused, so we'll have to explain both of them to you. So recipients, also always a noun phrase, and recipients will always receive a theme, so they're receiving some other noun phrase. So if I say Alex got a cake, we know that Alex received a cake. We don't know if Alex did anything with this cake. We don't know if the cake changed form in any way, but we do know that Alex received it. So Alex would be the recipient in this case, and not really an agent. Alex is not doing anything. Alex is receiving something. It's not an experiencer. Alex isn't experiencing any state of being, but there is a recipient because cake would be the theme that's changing location and going to Alex. Or mom read us a story. We're the recipients of that reading by having that story read to us. And so this is not something that is an action, and it's not something that is a patient. We're not really directly affected by the reading, but we are receiving that theme of a story. Beneficiaries, which are related in concept, are also noun phrases, but they benefit from an action. So they're not receiving a theme. There's always some other noun phrase with the recipient. Beneficiaries benefit directly from some action. So if I say they helped the elderly woman cross the street, there's no theme to be received, but they are benefiting from the action of the help. So they helped the elderly woman cross the street. The elderly woman would be the beneficiary of help. Or Pat baked a cake for Alex. We don't know if Alex has received the cake. We don't know if the cake has been delivered, but we know that the cake is for Alex. So in this case, Alex is benefiting from the baking specifically, even though they may or may not have the cake in their possession already. And then the last couple that we'll look at are based on location. So location itself is a theta role, and this is a static location. So you can think of it using the preposition at. A lot of times if you see at, you have some sort of location. So if I say the library has a lot of books, I'm locating the library, and the library isn't really doing anything. It's not receiving anything. It's just being located in this particular case. Or I can't eat lunch at Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A is being located. It's a static location. I have that at that gives me a sort of clue for it. And then the other two are locations, but they involve some sort of motion. So we have sources and goals, where a source is the starting point of motion. So you can use the preposition from as a way to notice that. So if I say I'm flying from Boise to SFO, Boise would be my starting point of motion. So I have that from that gives me a hint, and I'm starting there, but there's some sense of motion that's involved with that. There's some transfer of location. Or she left her house. I don't know where she's going, but I do know where the starting point was when she left. So the meanings that are there, the interpretation also has to be based on what the meaning of the actual verbs are, in addition to hints like prepositions. And then goal would be the end point of motion, so the sort of to preposition. So I'm flying from Boise to SFO. I know that the goal, the end point of motion, is SFO, so I have a goal in that case. I'm not just locating a static location. I'm in transit. There's some sense of motion here. Or she left for work. I don't know where she started, but I do know what the end goal is, what the end point of that motion is going to be. So in that case, goal would be, work would be a goal. So those are the theta roles that you should be familiar with. When we go over them, when we're practicing them, you'll usually get a sort of subset of these to keep in mind as you're trying to determine what's happening in a given sentence. The next area of semantics that we'll talk about are known as taxonomies. And these give a hierarchy relationship. So things that are at the bottom of a taxonomy would be sort of a subset, a type of an item that's above it. So if you think of biological trees and the ways that these different kinds of taxonomies in biology are organized, it's the same kind of idea, where something that's on a lower level is a type of something that's at the higher level. So if we have different kinds of animals, I can say that a tiger is a specific type of cat, and then cat would be a specific type of animal. So you get more generalized as you move further up, and you get more specific as you move further down. So the higher level words we call hypernyms, a broader category of those lower level words, where the lower level words are hyponyms, a more specific category of those broader terms above it. And the way that taxonomies are useful in how we think about meaning is because of the way that we organize our thoughts. So we have things that can be many different levels of specificity, where something is very, very broad like animal, or we can have something like cat, we can have something like tiger, we can have different kinds of tigers. We can get more and more specific or more and more broad. But the important part here, and what we typically tend to organize our thoughts around with meaning, what are known as basic level categories. So these basic level categories are things that tend to be what we think of most commonly in our daily life. So sometimes we have words that are very, very broad. These tend to be hypernyms, broad categories like plant, animal, furniture. And then we have things that tend to be very specific hyponyms, things like a poppy, a poodle, stool, which are types of those other three that are above, but they're very specific types. So what we're looking for in how we tend to organize the world around us are these basic level categories, the very high frequency sort of mid-level categories, something like flower or dog or chair. So cat would be a hypernym of tiger, but also a hyponym of animal. So it's sort of in the middle, and this would be a basic level category. If I showed you a picture of something and asked you to identify if it was a cat versus if it was a tiger, you'd probably answer quicker for a basic level category than you would if you were given a more specific one. So we think of these more readily, they're more frequently used, and they tend to come to mind faster when we test these out. And we can look at lots of different kinds of taxonomy. So different kinds of animals fall into this, but so do things like colors. So we can have warm colors, a very broad category, cool colors, also a very broad category. We can have very specific kinds of different colors, but the ones that we think of most commonly are things like pink, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. These are the basic color categories that we organize our life around. So even if you know that lavender is a lighter shade of purple, you're probably still more likely to respond to purple with different purple shades than you are to identify if something is or isn't lavender, because you have to kind of think about the specificness of lavender when you're trying to identify it. We also can call something lavender purple, and it would still fit into our understanding of that color, even if we have a more specific term that we can use. We can also do things like furniture. So we can have a very broad category of furniture, but the words we're most likely to use are things like table, chair, bed. We're likely to be a little bit specific and use those basic categories, and then really only dive into the hyper-specific ones like office chair, beanbag, stool, if we're talking about a certain kind of chair, if it's relevant for that. So that gives us a little bit about taxonomies. And then the last section that we'll talk about for semantics is prototypes and exemplars. And so an exemplar is just a member of some sort of category. It's a specific example of that category. So if I show you a bunch of different birds, each time I show you one, it would be an exemplar of bird, of the category bird. So each use of a word is also an exemplar of that specific form and meaning pair for whatever that word is doing in context. But we have some categories and some words and exemplars that are more prototypical than others. They're ones that come to mind faster. So this idea in semantics of prototype theory comes from the idea that we have a best exemplar as a prototype. So it could be the most frequent category member. It could have the most traits that are most commonly associated with that category. And these are usually the first things you think of when you are asked to name some member of that category. So they're cognitively salient. Our brain processes them faster. And so this started in the 1970s when they were trying to understand how we're processing these different categories and these different levels of things. So it's related in some ways to taxonomies, but thinking about which one is the one that we think about fastest. So if you're shown a bunch of pictures and you're asked, is this a bird? You're likely to respond yes much faster to a word like robin or a picture like robin than you are to a penguin. And the reason for this is because it fits more of those prototypical sort of examples of what a bird is. When we think about what is a bird, robins fit that bill better. They're sort of small, they fly, they have wings, they have nests, they lay eggs, all of these kinds of things that we associate with birds, we would think of faster with robin than something like penguin, which are much larger, which don't fly, etc. So those kinds of examples, when we draw out an exemplar theory graph, we arrange them in these sort of concentric circles where the things that are more prototypical would be in the center, things that are less prototypical would be further out on the edges. So to look at an example of this, if we think about birds still, we know that they're relatively small, they have feathers, they can fly, they build nests, they lay eggs, etc., etc. So depending on where you're from, in the Northern Hemisphere and in the United States, we tend to think of smaller birds, things like finches, sparrows, robins, that match this description. They're more prototypical birds. But then there are lots of other things that fall into this category that maybe we don't think of as quickly. So penguins don't fly, puffins don't build nests, emus are very, very large, and so these are non-prototypical, but they're still birds. So if you were asked, is an emu a bird? You would probably still say yes, but it will take you a little bit longer to say yes than if you saw something like a sparrow. So we can put into these categories, into these different circles, and this is just one example, where things like robins, sparrows, cardinals, canaries, orioles would be closer to the middle because they fit more of those examples. Things like chickens, turkeys, eagles, a little further out. Yeah, we recognize them as birds, but maybe not quite as quickly. And then things like ostrich or penguin would be much further out because they are much less like birds in our minds than these other more prototypical ones. But this can be based on where you're from. So if you're from Australia, maybe emu is closer in because you see them more frequently. Or if you're here in Idaho, maybe goose is closer in because we see them everywhere all the time. So depending on where you are, you may also have a slightly different interpretation of this. These are culturally and geographically dependent as well. So that's all of the new information I have. What I'm going to do with these next couple slides, since we don't have an in-class opportunity to talk about these topics, is give you some practice activities. So with these, I'm just going to hold on to each slide for a few seconds. You're able to pause the video, practice, and then after you unpause it, it will give you the answers for each slide, and then it'll move on to the next slide, and so forth and so forth. And so that way you can kind of practice, test yourself out, or just go through fast and look at the answers as well. And it just gives you a little bit of extra practice time for this. So a recap of theta roles. And then some practice for theta roles. So here's sentence 1. And then the answers for sentence 1. Here's sentence 2. And then the answers for sentence 2. Here is sentences 3 and 4. And answers for these ones. The next one is a taxonomy practice. So with these words, create a taxonomy relationship, a sort of hierarchy drawing. And then as you drew it out, it should look something like this. And then finally, a prototype model practice. So these are terms for canines, so these all fall within that somewhere. So thinking about where you would put them in relationship on different circles. And then an answer key for this one. So as always, if you have questions, email me, schedule office hours. We won't have a chance to really talk about these topics much in synchronous class, but next week when we do have synchronous classes, you are welcome to bring any questions you have if there are still things that stand out that you haven't been able to get answered through watching the lecture or through emailing me or scheduling office hours. So you do have those options available to you as well.